Other news now today, authorities identified one of the victims in the Gilgo Beach murders. Her remains found nearly 3 decades ago off of Fire Island. The CBS 2's Jennifer McLogan reports Jane Doe number 7 now has a name.
The FBI, state and county police joined Suffolk prosecutors, revealing another critical step in the Rex Heuermann investigation. Although no additional cases are linked to him, through modern DNA, another female victim has been identified, formerly known as Jane Doe number 7, Fire Island.
We are here to announce that as part of the Gilgo Task Force re-examination of all the evidence in the case, we were able to identify Fire Island Jane Doe as Karen Vergata, who was 34 years old at the time of her disappearance.
Karen Vergata's last known address was West 45th Street in Manhattan. She grew up in Glen Head. Her family, we're told, lost track of her. She was believed to have worked as an escort at the time of her disappearance. No charges have been filed in connection with this case. 27 years later, a DNA profile suitable for genealogical comparison was developed from Vergata, and using a cheek swab from her relative, the FBI made a match. Part of Vergata's body, her legs, were discovered in Davis Park, Fire Island in 1996. Sadly, her skull recovered near Gilgo in Tobay Beach 15 years later. Back in 2020, Suffolk released images of a belt embossed with the initials WH or HM, which could have belonged to the Heuermanns. Maureen Brainerd Barnes' remains were bound with that belt. She is part of the Gilgo 4. Heuermann is a prime suspect in her killing. The arrest of Rex Heuermann is making global news.
We were driving up from North Carolina, and we came to Ocean Parkway. And I said, hey, this is Gilgo Beach. This is where a lot of this happened.
Sorry for the loss, and I'm glad they actually got the guy who did it. And I hope they get some comfort right now.
And I feel bad for all those families.
Members of the Gilgo Beach Homicide Task Force that broke the 13-year-old unsolved mystery with the arrest of accused serial killer Rex Heuermann say they will not rest until all 10 bodies dumped along Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach are identified.
Karen Elaine Vergata was born on 4 November 1961 inches, Glen Head, a residential community in Nassau County on Long Island, New York. She grew up during a period when Long Island was undergoing significant economic and social change, as the suburban region increasingly became home to working families and middle-class residents commuting to New York City. Her early years were shaped by the familiar environment of the northeastern coastal suburbs of the United States, where life moved at a relatively calm pace compared to the intensity of Manhattan. Karen attended North Shore High School. Those who knew her during this period often described her as having a distinct personality, emotionally expressive, and inclined to present herself in a way that stood apart from others. She was not someone who easily blended into a crowd. Her creative thinking and independent nature left a lasting impression on friends and those around her. As the 1980s and early 1990s progressed, the New York area became one of the largest economic centers in the United States. Rapid urban development brought significant changes in career opportunities, lifestyles, and social connections. Within this environment, Karen's life gradually shifted away from her hometown and became more connected to the broader urban landscape. Many years later, Karen's name would appear in a complex and long-running investigation linked to the Long Island coastline. Around the same time, another figure who would later draw public attention was Rex Heuermann, born in 1963, an architect living in Massapequa Park, New York. However, at this stage, the story still centered on individuals living their separate lives in a vast metropolitan region where millions passed one another daily, unaware that their fates would one day be recorded within the same investigative file years later. In the mid-1990s, Karen Elaine Vergata was living in Manhattan, one of the most densely populated and dynamic areas of New York City. Life in the city moved at a fast pace, where millions of people each day moved between office buildings, subway stations, and streets that were constantly illuminated. Like many other residents, Karen was trying to build her own life within this highly competitive and constantly shifting environment. According to information released later, Karen worked in the escort industry. This was a field that often existed on the margins of mainstream society, where many women faced financial pressure, unstable working conditions, and uncertain personal relationships. However, her occupation did not define her entirely. Before appearing in investigative reports, she was simply a woman trying to maintain her daily life in a vast city. Karen was also a mother of 2 sons. Before her death, circumstances in her life led to the children being placed with adoptive families. This became an important part of her story, reflecting the difficulties she faced over the years. However, relatively little information about her private life is available, as few records were preserved and few individuals publicly shared details about that period. Those who knew Karen remembered her as a woman with a distinct personality, at times reserved but still maintaining social connections around her. Like countless other New Yorkers at the time, she would wake up each day, go to work, meet people she knew, and continue with the plans of her everyday life. No one around her had any reason to believe that her name would one day disappear from ordinary life and later reappear in a case file that would draw significant attention from investigators. At this stage, Karen was still an ordinary resident of Manhattan. Her life included its own challenges, personal choices, and concerns, much like those of many others. Everything appeared to continue in a familiar way until the final day she was seen alive. The 14th of February 1996 was the final point in time when investigators determined that Karen Elaine Vergata was still present in everyday life. At that time, she was living in Manhattan, within a vast city where millions of people moved through daily routines, and the disappearance of an individual could sometimes be obscured by the pace of urban life. According to information released later, this was the last confirmed day Karen was known to be alive. After that point, her trace effectively stopped. What made the case complex from the beginning was the absence of any missing person report filed immediately after Karen disappeared. In many situations, prompt notification by family or friends can generate important early leads for investigators. However, in Karen's case, this did not occur. There was no large-scale search effort. No urgent local media alerts were issued. Her name was not quickly added to any active missing persons list, requiring immediate attention. This lack of initial reporting created a gap in information that turned Karen's final days into a mystery within the investigative file. Authorities later faced significant difficulty attempting to reconstruct her movements prior to her disappearance. There was almost no clear data regarding where Karen had gone, who she had met, or what activities she had undertaken during that final period. Every missing answer led to further questions. Where had Karen left Manhattan to go? Who was the last person to see her? Had anyone noticed her absence in the following days? These questions remained unanswered for many years. As time passed, verifying these details became increasingly difficult, as witness memories faded and early traces disappeared. At the time, no one knew that Karen's disappearance would mark the beginning of an investigation spanning nearly 3 decades. And it would take more than 2 months after she was last seen before an unexpected discovery on Fire Island brought the case to the attention of law enforcement authorities. On the 20th of April 1996, more than 2 months after Karen Vergata was last confirmed to be alive in official records, an unusual discovery was made at Davis Park on Fire Island, a narrow barrier island off the southern coast of Long Island. While walking along the shoreline, 2 members of the public noticed a plastic bag lying among the sand and coastal vegetation. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than ordinary debris washed up by the tide. However, upon closer inspection, they realized there were concerning contents inside and immediately contacted the authorities. The Suffolk County Police Department responded to the scene. The area was quickly secured, and access was restricted as officers worked to preserve the integrity of the location. When the investigation began, authorities determined that the plastic bag contained human remains. From that point on, the scene was treated as a potential homicide investigation. Forensic teams conducted a systematic search of the surrounding area, looking for any additional evidence that might be linked to the victim. Every detail was carefully documented, from the exact location of the discovery to environmental conditions, in an effort to reconstruct what may have occurred. However, a major obstacle quickly emerged. There were no identification documents, no personal belongings, and no immediate clues pointing to the victim's identity. In the investigative system, a temporary file was opened. The unidentified woman was recorded under the name Fire Island Jane Doe. At that time, no one knew that her identity would remain unknown for nearly 3 decades, and that this case would eventually become part of a much larger investigation spanning Long Island. After securing the area where the remains were discovered, Suffolk County investigative units, in cooperation with forensic specialists, began a comprehensive analysis of everything recovered at Davis Park. Each item of evidence was sealed, catalogued, and sent to the laboratory for examination. The priority at that stage was to determine who the deceased was, where she came from, and whether any trace evidence could lead to her identity. Specialists documented anthropological characteristics, estimating age, sex, and other basic biological information relevant to identification efforts. At the same time, several samples were preserved for future testing. This was an important step, as investigators understood that new scientific techniques might emerge in the years ahead, potentially providing answers that were not possible at the time. Initial analysis indicated that the deceased was an adult female. However, the data obtained was still insufficient to match her with any specific record. Authorities reviewed missing persons lists from New York and surrounding states and distributed information to other law enforcement agencies in search of any potential match. All possible avenues were considered, from traditional identification methods to dental comparisons and existing record checks. However, 1996 was a period when DNA technology was still in its early stages compared to modern standards. Genetic analysis capabilities were limited, and the databases used for comparison were not yet extensive enough to support complex long-term investigations. Tools that are now considered standard either did not exist or were not widely implemented at the time. Over time, the number of useful leads diminished. The Fire Island Jane Doe file remained active within the system, but there was no breakthrough strong enough to move the investigation forward. Although key evidence was carefully preserved, the woman's identity remained a gap in the record for many years that followed. Entering 2010, a search operation linked to another missing persons case led Suffolk County authorities to the Gilgo Beach area, along Ocean Parkway on the southern shore of Long Island. What initially appeared to be a routine search quickly escalated into one of the largest criminal investigations in New York State history. During systematic ground searches supported by K-9 units, police began uncovering human remains at multiple locations. These discoveries immediately drew nationwide media attention, turning the Gilgo Beach case into a major long-term investigation. As the search expanded through 2010 and 2011, the number of victims recovered continued to rise. Forensic specialists, investigators, and law enforcement agencies from multiple jurisdictions worked together to analyze the evidence collected along Ocean Parkway. Amid the growing number of open cases, investigators also revisited earlier unsolved files, including the Fire Island Jane Doe case, dating back to 1996. In 2011, a key discovery was made near Ocean Parkway. Search teams recovered a human skull at a site more than 20 kilometers from Fire Island. Forensic experts then conducted DNA comparisons between this newly recovered remains and samples preserved from the 1996 investigation. The results confirmed that both sets of remains belonged to the same woman. This finding marked a significant development in the Fire Island Jane Doe case. After years of existing as a fragmented file with limited information, investigators now had a crucial link between two separate discoveries. Evidence from different locations had finally been connected through scientific analysis. However, this breakthrough did not solve the central question. Although the remains were confirmed to belong to the same individual, authorities still did not know who she was. Traditional identification methods continued to yield no results. No missing persons reports matched the available data. No relatives came forward with a viable comparison sample. No clear lead emerged to restore the victim's identity. As the Gilgo Beach investigation gained increasing public attention, Fire Island Jane Doe remained in the system as an unidentified case. It would take more than another decade before new scientific advances would open a completely different path towards solving the mystery. From 1996 to 2023, the woman discovered on Fire Island existed within the investigative system under a temporary designation, Jane Doe 7. This was the standard label used by law enforcement agencies for cases in which a victim's identity could not be determined, despite repeated efforts to do so. In the official case file, biological data, forensic findings, and investigative reports were carefully preserved, but the most important element remained missing: the name of the deceased. That period lasted nearly 3 decades. Many investigators who originally worked on the case retired or were reassigned to other units. Identification methods used in the early years gradually became outdated as forensic science advanced. Even so, the Fire Island Jane Doe file was never fully closed. It remained listed among Suffolk County's unsolved cases, awaiting a breakthrough capable of reshaping the entire investigation. Elsewhere, individuals connected by blood to Karen Vergata continued their lives without knowing what had truly happened. According to later released records, the family was not aware that the woman known as Fire Island Jane Doe and Karen were, in fact, the same person. The two narratives existed in parallel for years without ever being connected. Within the field of criminal investigation, the case gradually became a reference example of unidentified remains. It reflected the limitations of earlier forensic technology, as well as the difficulty of resolving cases that span multiple generations of investigative practice. Although the physical evidence remained preserved, the most crucial answer continued to elude authorities. By the early 2020s, however, Advances in genetic science began to offer new hope for cold cases that had long appeared unsolvable. The investigation into Jane Doe 7 was about to enter an entirely new phase. In 2022, the Fire Island Jane Doe investigation entered its most critical phase since the case file was first opened nearly 3 decades earlier. After years of preserving evidence, the Gilgo Beach Task Force decided to apply modern genetic analysis techniques to the biological samples collected during the original investigation. This approach represented a significant departure from what authorities were capable of achieving in the mid-1990s. Forensic specialists began constructing a new, higher-resolution DNA profile made possible by advances in genome sequencing technology. The resulting genetic data was then forwarded to units specializing in genetic genealogy, a field that had already produced major breakthroughs in identifying unidentified victims across the United States. Rather than searching for a direct match in existing criminal databases, analysts focused on tracing distant biological relatives through genealogical databases authorized for investigative use. This process required coordination across multiple expert teams. Family trees were reconstructed from DNA data, civil records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and publicly available archival documents. The work took months and involved reviewing thousands of connections, eliminating leads that did not fit the genetic profile. Each new finding was carefully cross-checked multiple times to ensure accuracy before moving forward. Unlike the investigators in 1996, who were largely constrained by the technology of their time, the specialists in 2022 had tools capable of tracing genetic markers across multiple generations. What had once been an impenetrable gap in the investigation began to reveal meaningful connections. After nearly 3 decades existing under a temporary designation, the Jane Doe 7 case was finally approaching a point where the identity of the woman behind the evidence could be determined. What investigators had once pursued in vain was now emerging from the victim's own genetic data. In August 2023, after months of genetic data analysis and verification of familial connections, the Suffolk County Police Department held a press conference announcing the result investigators had pursued for nearly 3 decades. The woman previously known as Fire Island Jane Doe had finally been identified. Her name was Karen Elaine Vergata. The announcement marked one of the most significant breakthroughs in the investigation. For the first time since the remains were discovered on Fire Island in 1996, the case file no longer carried the designation of an unidentified victim. Instead, investigators were able to connect forensic evidence to a specific person, a specific life, and a real family. What had existed for years as anonymized data within a criminal database was now restored to the identity of a woman named Karen Vergata. To reach this conclusion, experts used genetic genealogy to trace distant familial connections. After narrowing down potential lines of descent, authorities collected DNA samples from relatives for direct comparison. The final results confirmed a match strong enough to establish that Fire Island, Jane Doe, and Karen Vergata were the same individual. This decisive verification ended the nearly 27-year existence of an unnamed case file. For Karen's family, the announcement provided answers they had waited years to receive. Although the passage of time could not repair the loss they had endured, learning the truth about her fate marked a significant moment of closure. For investigators, the case became a clear example of how modern forensic science can resolve cold cases once thought to be beyond reach. However, identifying the victim was only one part of the case. The name Karen Vergata had been restored, but the cause of her death remained unresolved. The woman once labeled Jane Doe now had her identity back, yet the central question of the entire investigation still remained. Who was responsible for what happened to Karen Vergata? After Karen Vergata's identity was confirmed in 2023, public attention quickly turned toward a name that had already become prominent in the Gilgo Beach investigation, Rex Heuermann. Born in 1963, Heuermann is an architect from Massapequa Park in Nassau County, New York. For many years, he maintained the outward appearance of an ordinary working professional, running his practice and living within his local community without drawing significant public attention. In July 2023, Heuermann was arrested following a large-scale investigation conducted by the Gilgo Beach Task Force. Prosecutors later charged him in connection with the deaths of several women whose remains were discovered along Ocean Parkway. The arrest quickly became one of the most closely followed developments in New York, marking a major step forward in a case that had remained without a clear suspect for more than a decade. As investigators reviewed the broader scope of the Gilgo Beach case, Karen Vergata's name was also revisited. This was due to the fact that her remains were discovered within the wider geographic area under investigation. The timing of her identification, occurring shortly after Heuermann's arrest, led to increased public speculation about possible links between the cases. However, Available legal records to date indicate an important fact. Rex Heuermann has not been charged in relation to Karen Vergata's death. While he faces serious accusations in other cases within the Gilgo Beach investigation, prosecutors have not presented sufficient evidence to indict him in connection with Karen. As a result, his name does not currently appear in any formal charges related to her case. For this reason, Karen Vergata's case remains officially unresolved. Investigators continue to analyze forensic evidence, review historical records, and assess new leads emerging from the ongoing Gilgo Beach investigation. The identification of Karen resolved one of the case's most enduring mysteries, but it did not answer the question of who was responsible for her death. At present, Karen Vergata has been restored to her name after nearly 3 decades of anonymity. However, criminal responsibility in her case has not yet been established. Until further evidence is released or formal charges are filed, her death remains one of the unanswered threads within the broader Gilgo Beach investigation. As of the present time, the case file involving Karen Vergata has not reached the conclusion many had hoped for. Establishing her identity resolved a crucial part of the investigation, but the justice system still lacks sufficient grounds to bring the case to trial. No individual has been formally charged in connection with Karen's death. No court proceedings have been held, nor has any legal judgment been issued, establishing criminal responsibility for what occurred in 1996. Meanwhile, the investigation continues to be actively maintained by law enforcement agencies in New York. Evidence preserved over many years is still being reviewed alongside new data emerging from the broader Gilgo Beach investigation. Authorities have not closed the case, meaning the possibility of additional evidence or new leads remains open. For Karen's family, learning that the Fire Island Jane Doe had been their loved one brought an answer they had waited nearly 3 decades to receive. However, that truth of identity only resolved part of the story. What remains unanswered is the cause of her death, and who should be held legally responsible. After 27 years, Karen Vergata is no longer listed under a temporary designation in the investigative system. She has been restored to her real name, yet the pursuit of justice has not reached its end. The central question of the case still stands, awaiting a clear and official answer: who is responsible for the death of Karen Vergata? Nearly 3 decades is a long enough period for memories to fade, for witnesses to disappear, and for case files to slowly slip into obscurity. For Karen Vergata's family, it was also a period spent without clear answers about the fate of their loved one. When her identity was finally confirmed in 2023, the truth ultimately emerged, but only after decades of waiting. What was uncovered could not bring Karen back, nor could it fill the absence left in the lives of those connected to her. This case highlights a significant reality in modern criminal investigation. Time may cool a case file, but it does not necessarily erase the possibility of uncovering the truth. Evidence preserved since 1996 endured long enough for suitable scientific methods to emerge. What once exceeded the capabilities of investigators decades earlier was eventually resolved through the technology of a later generation. Karen's story also serves as a reminder that behind every unidentified case file is a real individual with a past, relationships, and a personal history. For many years, the world knew her only as Fire Island Jane Doe. Yet in the end, Karen was no longer a designation in an evidence archive. She was Karen Vergata, a mother, a daughter, and a person who once lived among those who loved her. After nearly 3 decades of silence, her name was finally restored to where it always belonged.